do this introduction. So welcome everyone. My name is Alyssa Dennis. I'm the face behind Eclipta Herbal. And I'm here with my co-host, Gaja Mežnarić Osole. I'm calling in from Piscataway land here in Baltimore, Maryland, and Gaja is in Slovenia. So we have Marc here with us, Marc Williams today, and we're so grateful for him joining us. This has been a great series. We're so excited to have him. So knowledgeable about plants, about our ecosystem, and more importantly, about invasive plants. So I just want to say a little bit about the series, just in case this is your first time. So the Invasive Species Creative Proposal Series, this is the 7th or 8th talk that we have posted. And really this talk encompasses artists, herbalists, ecologists. We're all working on creative solutions to the spread of invasive plant species. But we're also active in challenging the current toxic, capital-centric, xenophobic, warlike paradigm that's setting up policies for the management of these species. So these are virtual lectures. They're all free. They're initiated by myself, Eclipta Herbal and Krater. And that is Gaja's organization. So, and we present each of these earth workers as practitioners of the land. This endeavor provides a collective platform to share their values, our values, and approaches to their work regarding holistic understanding and interaction with these novel ecosystems. And so, yeah, I encourage you to contact us if you have any other further questions about the series. All of these talks are free via YouTube. So you will get a link to all of those talks from signing up. So yeah, I just want to introduce Marc. So Marc is an ethnobiologist. He has taught hundreds of classes to thousands of people about plants, humans, other life forms, and their interface. His training includes a BA in Environmental Studies, Sustainable Agriculture from Warren Wilson College, with a minor in Business, and an MA in Appalachian Studies, Sustainable Development from Appalachian State University, with a minor in Planning and Geography. Just if anyone has not muted. Okay, so he has spent over 20 years working at various restaurants, farms, and travels throughout 30 countries in Central, North, and South America, Europe, and all 50 states in the US. More information can be found at his website, which is botany-everyday.com, but also at plantsandhealers.org. So yeah, this talk is Food and Fermentation with Exotic Invasives with Marc Williams. So you want to take it away, Marc?
All right. Yes, I am so excited to be here, grateful, honored. I've been taking in some of the other offerings of this series in preparation for this class and just feel really stoked to be in such good company. And yeah, I am coming to you. I would like to acknowledge from the traditional land of the Cherokee, who are amazing people that continue to persist to this day in many amazing ways, and certainly have learned to incorporate some exotic invasive species into their ethnobotany in interesting ways as well. And yeah, I think I'm gonna just go ahead and try to share my screen, and then we can kind of go forward from there. Does that look all right? Okay. And then for some reason it's not advancing, but that looks like it advanced. Okay. So I've been working on this subject pretty hardcore for about 14 years. When I was in graduate school, I had a sustainable development class that I first wrote a paper on this subject for. which was challenges and opportunities with exotic invasive plants. And I've gone on to present on this subject at international conferences and lots of other places since then. And that's 14 years. And it may sound like a lot. It actually sounds surprisingly like a lot to me. But at the same time, it's super humbling how much I'm still learning, like I said, from looking at other presenters of the series and through going through the continuing development of literature that is happening. And this is the subject of an online class that I do by donation at the first website cited here, botanyeveryday.com. So if you're really interested in going deeper than what I'm able to cover today, and also looking for the citations for the information that I share, you can find all of that at botanyeveryday.com. And then, as was mentioned, plantsandhealers.org, that's a nonprofit that was founded to continue the work of one of my greatest teachers and mentors, Frank Cook, and is no longer a functioning organization, but that website will continue. And there's also, with both of these websites, Facebook groups that continue on to share this information. And I would say a lot of the inspiration that I got for the class I am talking to you about today came from my teacher, Frank Cook. And in particular, he had this great saying that's actually on my shirt. It's a little bit hard to see, but it says, eat something wild every day, right? Which kind of ties into this idea of exotic invasives in the form of wild foods. So as I mentioned, I started this whole thing as an academic exercise in graduate school. And so that's kind of how some of this is still laid out, with my hypothesis being that basically many plants listed as exotic invasives have ethnobotanical uses beyond those typically explored. And harvesting exotic invasives for these uses may be a potential additional strategy in an integrated pest management, or known as IPM program, for exotic invasive control. And the purpose of my research is understanding of the issues concerning the exotic invasive plants in general, and within Appalachia and the Southeast in particular. The ultimate goal was to create a spreadsheet that elucidates the potential ignored uses for exotic invasive plants as a method for control. And really coming out of the concept of permaculture, which I imagine most of you are familiar with now, but if you're not, that's some homework. Learn about this concept of permaculture, which is key to our probably survival as a species to some degree. But the concept of that is to turn a problem into a resource, and certainly exotic invasives are often characterized as problems. So the methods that I went about to do this is to review the literature from invasive ecology, land management, restoration, and ethnobotany, and use that to understand the phenomenon of exotic invasive plants and their potential uses. And I created spreadsheets to determine the themes and invasiveness and recognition by, in particular, the southeastern states. So this is an example of the spreadsheet, and this is something that you could find at botanyeveryday.com under the resources tab. And basically what I did was I lined up everything first by family, then by scientific name, then by common name. And then all the little small columns that are kind of in the middle there are how different states treated these plants in a regulatory framework. And then commentary about their potential applications with citations from where those applications came from is kind of how that finishes out. And we'll kind of talk about some of the more specific members of that list as time goes on. But really kind of just getting a little bit more of an understanding of what are exotic invasives, although I imagine most of you, if not all of you, have ideas. And this is one definition, that they are species or organisms that become established in natural or semi-natural ecosystems or habitats, or agents of change and threaten native biological diversity. Okay. And in the US, exotic invasives are normally considered to be those established since European colonization. And already by 2010, there were about 5,600 plus species considered exotic invasives in the US. So there are a lot of different terms that are used for these organisms, and in the regard to plants, there's terms like noxious weeds, non-indigenous, non-native, alien. And I think this is kind of one of the first stops that goes to one of the big goals of this series, is this idea of how do we frame these organisms, right? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next slide, but I just feel like that oftentimes they're just in general framed negatively. And so I've heard some other terms that have come up that I've put on the second line underneath the noxious weeds: non-indigenous, non-native, alien, which is enthusiastic, feral, overabundant, and underappreciated. So, I mean, in so many things in life, whether we're talking about plants or people or microbes or whatever, words really matter. And the word choice that is used and due to some kind of perspective or agenda. So I really do want to unpack this perspective on exotic invasives and this conceptual framework that goes into kind of defining them and delineating them. And I do want to say first and foremost that I am a big fan of native plants. I'm on the board of directors of United Plant Savers, which is a nonprofit established to preserve native medicinal plants in particular, of native plant gardens I caretake and try to steward as much as possible. And at the same time, I will say that yeah, I just feel like this characterization within the exotic invasives is very problematic, right? And it's very like kind of black or white and yes or no. And so to just kind of walk through some of the problematic pieces, one is this idea of colonial set points. So basically, when people came over here in the 1400s and the 1500s and 1600s, started to describe the nature as they saw it, then this is often considered to be kind of the golden standard for like what I term perfect nature, right? And so in particular, when you have a lot of, say, native plant societies or something, which I certainly work with and lecture for and totally honor. And at the same time, there's this idea that we're going to take back our land to this set point that was first described. And yeah, I mean, it's basically impossible that we could do that for a lot of different reasons. And so to walk through what some of those reasons are, one is former land tenure, right? So we had a huge array of indigenous groups throughout North America, other places throughout the world too, managing the land for, in the case of North America, at least probably tens of thousands of years. And then in a very short order, within a matter of centuries, most of these folks died due to the guns, germs, and steel, and a lot of it being the germs, and didn't even see white people before they were taken away. And all the fire regimes, all the other management techniques that had been in place for tens of thousands of years just kind of like immediately dropped away, right? And so even when the people first got here in the 1400s and 1500s and started categorizing these things, it was like a snapshot in time of a regime that was already set to change because the land tenure had changed. Now, beyond that, you know, way more prehistorically, you have huge megafauna, you know, giant sloths and armadillos and buffalo and elk and mega predators, saber-toothed tigers, all of these different things, wild horses. I mean, all these things in North America that then went extinct in a prehistoric sense, you know, largely by about 10,000 years ago. But that's like a blip in time for geology, right? And so these plants that have been around for millions of years, 10,000 years is nothing, right? And so that's been a huge shift as well. Another thing around this idea of exotic invasives, as I said on the previous slide, is just this idea of them only being bad, right? That they don't have potential ecosystem services, such as preventing erosion, such as potentially being good for pollinators, and certainly a big focus that we'll have in this talk today about being good for people, potentially for food or medicine, and in particular in regards to fermented products. Another thing would be habitat affected. So most exotic invasives tend to just grow in disturbed areas and in full sun, in places that are typically um, occupied by humans, roads, bridges, cities, farms and gardens don't tend to grow as much in the like kind of forest primeval, especially undisturbed forest, but that is certainly not the case for all of them. So basically there's this real broad brush that's often applied to these plants. And for just to be clear, most of the exotic plants that have been introduced to North America do not invade whatsoever. They just stay where you put them and they never go anywhere. That's the majority to begin with. And then a huge amount beyond that are going to be these more plants that are growing in disturbed environments in full sun. And it's a very small subset that are going to grow in undisturbed environments in the shade. And those tend to be, in my opinion, more of the problematic things to focus on control with. So beyond that, I've mentioned harvest for use as a means of control, which is pretty much almost never in the exotic invasive literature. And that's something that I would love to see remedied. You kind of have the wild edible literature over here, and you have the exotic invasive literature over there. And so one of my goals is to bridge those two together. Another one would be mischaracterization of nativity. So probably one of the most poisonous or poisoned, I mean, it's an amazing edible plant, but one of the most poisoned by people plants on the planet is dandelion. And dandelion, there are native dandelions to North America, right? There's also native yarrow, for instance, which is another plant that people traditionally might consider as exotic invasive. Another thing is just the idea of that set point, once again, from the 1500s, 1600s. I think we're all aware that that's long gone as far as the climate regime that was in place at that point, right? And so there's definitely people that are positing that, as we continue to live in a hotter world, that by definition, the ecosystems that are part of that world are going to change and evolve in order to adapt to the new regime. And some of these exotic invasives are primed and ready to do that. I think of the photosynthetic regime that plants like pigweed have, or even corn, or lamb's quarters, that they're able to photosynthesize at higher, hotter temperatures. And I mean, I guess I kind of said habitat affected, some more invasive than others. It's kind of ties together that way. I mean, there are other pieces around why are things more invasive than others, like as far as how they're propagated, and we'll talk more about that. But lastly, I think this idea of the xenophobic languaging that often goes into the exotic invasive dialogue is, frankly, to me, very disturbing and even somewhat scary. I mean, this idea, for instance, of a plant that's traditionally called tree of heaven, and then people will call it tree of hell, or they just come up with all these names that like objectify these plants in hateful ways. And to me, it's very hard to unpack, even though I've been thinking about this for years, the kind of dialogue that is used in negative ways towards immigrants that are people, to new places, of which I feel like a lot of, like, especially native plant enthusiasts or something, would be abhorred by the word choice used. But then some of those same groups and same people might use those same words against these plants. And I know that in science, there's this idea of anthropomorphizing, right? And kind of putting plants within the people frame that is often, at least historically, considered problematic. I find it problematic actually to discount plants and consider them lower than people, or even like when we say there's people and animals, right? As if people aren't just one species of animal. I think this is all kind of like wedded into the problematic nature of this discourse, is like kind of considering people at the top and everything else below versus all of us as part of one whole. And so definitely word choice in regards to these plants that I would say to some degree are often, if not willingly, to give them agency, as has been mentioned, here to help us, they are potentially can help us, right? They have a lot of gifts that they're bringing. And we're kind of looking a gift horse in the mouth, as that term of speech goes, when they show up with these phytochemicals, for instance, it can help us fight the newest scourge that we're facing. But instead, we want to pour poisonous chemicals on top of them and make our problems in our society potentially worse. So thinking about the factors that affect exotic invasiveness is the idea of the ecosystem itself, how many species are in that ecosystem, as I mentioned already, how disturbed is it? Also, though, the ecotype, so the soil type, how much water there is, how many nutrients there are, what the climate is, what the topography, what the elevation is. And in general, with poorer soils and less water and less nutrients and a harsher climate and a higher elevation, then you're going to have less exotic invasiveness because it's just harder to persist. But there are definitely exotic invasives that are specialists in super hard habitats. And one of the other plants I won't cover, but has been covered through the series by other folks, is tamarisk in the desert Southwest, which is an excellent example. So thinking about the plant itself, the taxa, the species, their reproductive strategies, as I alluded to earlier, are going to be part of this ability to be an exotic invasive, as well as their relation to living forces and elemental forces. So you have the age to reproduction. Most exotic invasives reproduce in a year. Fecundity, so like how many seeds, like lamb's quarters can make 50,000 seeds, one plant. The ability to asexually reproduce, so to put up new plants by runners. In the case of dandelions, they can actually make clones through seeds, which is called apomixis, and that's really an unusual superpower. But definitely other ways that could happen, like a piece could break and fall and grow again, these types of things. Seed dispersal mechanisms, so like the dandelion being dispersed by the air, or you could think of like a common plant a lot of people know, like burdock, that gets stuck into the fur of passing animals, or you could think of something that floats in the water. Lots of different really interesting dispersal mechanisms. And of course, having a delicious fruit that is then going to be distributed by some other creature being another example. And this idea of fitness homeostasis is just kind of what I was talking about with the ecotype, the ability to adapt to drought, to floods, to cold, to heat, and those types of things. And then, of course, you have defensive mechanisms that plants could have that will protect themselves and keep them from being consumed by predators. So whether that's biological toxins, which often could be actually medicinal compounds, prickles or thorns, those kinds of like protective structures on the outside. I mentioned a little bit the photosynthetic rate in regards to things like amaranth and lamb's quarters and corn. And then you also have this idea of families that plants are part of that I'll certainly talk more about. But I guess I would just say, in short, for anybody that's not familiar, there's this idea of how plants are organized called taxonomy, right? And so every, whether it's a plant or an insect or a mushroom or whatever, has a scientific name that's combined of the genus, that's the first name, the general name, and the species, the second name, the specific name, right? And the next level up above that is the family. So in the whole world, 350,000 to 400,000 species, 20,000 plus genera, but there's really like, say, 400 plus families. The vast majority of all the families that somebody might be interested in places that get cold for food or medicine, fall within about 30 families, right? Versus the thousands of species that are represented within those families. But as I mentioned, the cold world, anywhere in general, you might have 160, 170 of those 400 plus families. So if you bring in a new family from somewhere else, then it's often going to not have pests that will keep it in control, and will be able to run more roughshod over the competition of its new location sometimes. All right, so how are they introduced? Lots of different ways. You've got ports of call with boats. You've got plant collectors. I've led international tours and was mentioned in the 30 countries myself and witnessed a lot of people that like to bring a lot of things back. And so that's really a huge factor that's very uncontrolled. Much more in control these days are things like botanical gardens, but historically that was one of the points of botanical gardens, was to be a point of introduction of exotic, new, interesting things, especially huge botanical gardens like Kew in London, England, or the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx, or some of these kind of like major institutions of colonial empires kind of thing. And then of course you have nursery people that want to grow new, unusual things. People bringing in foreign produce, either commercially or as tourists, research stations, factories, and yeah, as was mentioned, travelers more kind of, for fun than like, a hardcore plant collector or something like that. So lots of ways these plants have been introduced, and definitely how that problem becomes more of an issue are things like overgrazing, fertilization, and land disturbance. And then there are also some that are introduced by accident, like a traveler bringing something unusual back, but most of them have been brought in on purpose through things like the botanical gardens and the nursery people and the research stations. So the effects of exotic invasives, I think, are worth at least laying out there a little bit. For one, they cost billions of dollars each year, and control, we could argue if that's money wasted, especially because it's often not effective. But they also alter soil, water, nutrient, and fire regimes, because huge crop losses. They can cause loss of native species and biodiversity, and like some other forms of pollution, exotic invasives continue to spread. So like, for instance, you think of like an oil spill, eventually that is going to be something that is finite. And especially if it's non-refined oil, just like kind of raw oil, like coming out of the seafloor or something, there are actually microbes that have evolved to like eat that stuff and break it down. But with the exotic invasives, that's not as much the case, because they're a more recent introduction. That evolution hasn't happened, although it probably will eventually, to create homeostasis once again. But it's not just like a localized thing, I guess, is the biggest point, that they continue to radiate out and out and out. And like so many things that are health problems in regards to the exotic invasive one, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, so kind of trying to get it under control while it's in a small area. This is the idea of quarantining, for instance, before it can get kind of out of control and much more large spread, and then pretty much often impossible to put the genie back in the bottle at that point. So thinking, I just mentioned, prevention of establishment is the cheapest, most effective option, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Beyond that, you get into this idea of who are these exotic invasives, and how are they spreading, and in what areas, and how fast, and all these different things. But certainly a big indicator of whether something can be invasive in a new place is that it's invasive in an old place, right? And especially if the new place has a similar habitat regime to the old place. So planting of natives rather than exotics is definitely something to do. I think oftentimes, especially if we're talking about ornamental applications. And you've got this great book by the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens that speaks to native alternatives to invasive plants, that can lead you along that way quite a distance for pretty cheap. I bet you'd probably get it for $10 or less used online. So that would be a great resource if you're looking for alternatives. Now, as far as control goes, I'm definitely going to lead with this idea of harvest for use as a means of control, but I'm a realist enough to know that given the area of coverage by some of these things, that's, unless we really come to apocalypse point, which certainly could happen a lot of different ways, but there's just not enough time, energy, effort, and all these different things to really go at it that hardcore. So you have mechanical removal of these different things, which could then lead into harvest for use, but there definitely are, of course, lots of chemical controls that are out there. And I do want to unpack, even though I'm not a big fan of pesticides, I do feel like that they at times have their place in certain applications. But once again, it's often like a broad brush with more kind of, eco liberal people that, kind of just hate on the word chemical. And I do want to just say, as a scientist, that like the world is made of chemicals, right? Like nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen are also chemicals, right? I mean, and then they combine to make compounds, right? So it's not just, elements in general or compounds in general, it's which specific ones, right? And so beyond that, you have the what chemical, but then you have how you're going to apply it, when you're going to apply it, where you're going to apply it. You also have with the how, whether you're going to put it on the foliage or whether you're going to put it in this drench form that will go into the soil and be more systematic, which is of course much more of a hardcore activity that I think also needs a lot more studying as far as how is the soil affected when you drench it with these systemic pesticides versus just kind of spraying them on the surface of the plants that are of concern. But the systemic ones work a lot better, as you might imagine. So also very important to just think about wearing a protective equipment. PPE is the acronym, but personal protective equipment when administering these things. And a lot of people, they kind of also make this like false dichotomy. There's organic and then there's conventional, but there are organic herbicides, right? And just because something's organic doesn't mean it won't hurt you, right? So it's very important to understand that you still need to have this PPE stuff. A lot around organic herbicides revolves around the action of vinegar, really high pH, very acidic vinegar with maybe other substances combined with it. You have biological agents, so basically like life on life, duking it out, often with a plant, it would be like some kind of insect that will take down that plant. Kudzu, I think, is one of the more recent ones where there's this insect called the kudzu beetle, which is actually taking down the kudzu, or there's also one now taking down multiflora rose, for instance. They're using one for St. John's wort out west. So that's kind of a big thing. There's a USDA Forest Service publication I have here on the slide, for instance, that speaks about those plants I just mentioned and others. And then you have fire, right? Just burning things. Oftentimes you might do these regimes in combination with each other, though, I would say as well. So a big thing, though, is about education, tools of control. That's why I'm here right now, as I imagine a lot of you are too, is just to learn about these things and understand who they are, where they are, the extent of the problem. And there's lots of different regulations that have been formulated, but they really vary oftentimes from state to state and country to country. And even within the bioregion of the Southeast, really variable how different states characterize different plants, more so than is appropriate, basically. So thinking about novel invasive control, this is kind of coming more into the heart of the subject of the talk for today, is using these plants. And there's, 124 species or so. I bet it's closer to half of the 300 or so that are exotic invasives in the South, and Appalachia is a subset of that, and Southern Appalachia is a subset of that. And so of those 124, most of them have use as food or medicine. This goes back to that spreadsheet that I showed to begin with. 56 species out of that have top priority as an exotic invasive. And I do want to just mention that there are some unintended consequences that could come along with that are some devils in the details. So one is this idea that's also come up with other people in this series, presenting that these plants can potentially take out toxins, right? And so you need to be aware of that when you're harvesting, is a potentially polluted environment. And that's another thing, like this exotic invasive thing I've spent hundreds of hours of my life on, that would be a whole other talk. But I guess suffice it to say that my online class that I do at botanyeveryday.com, there is a whole class that's on that subject as well, which is called Plants for Phytoremediation, if you're interested. Another thing that comes up that really blew my mind when it was brought to my attention by one of my colleagues, Dr. Sunshine Brosey, is this idea that if exotic invasives become super popular, that people might actually want to protect them and promulgate them and spread them around. And I know in this paper by Nunes et al., they talked about an example of in Hawaii that pigs are not native to Hawaii, right? But they were brought there by the indigenous people of Hawaii, and since have like been destroying the very unusual, special, and doesn't occur anywhere else in the world native flora of Hawaii, right? And so there's now this dialogue, though, that's between the conservationists. There's like, we should preserve every single species that's in Hawaii as much as possible. And the native folks and their traditions with these pigs, where they're like, well, so you're putting plants over people. And once again, to me, they're all on even playing field. But there is this idea of how Hawaii was stolen, which is really getting off the rails a little bit, but not really even that long ago, 120 years ago from those people. And they're still pissed about it. And now like people kind of coming in, these outside experts saying that we're going to take more from your culture on top of it, you know? So I'm probably just in the interest of time, not able to really honor this dialogue as much as I would like, but it's a fascinating concept, and it certainly has played out with other exotic invasives. I know in my community, a plant we're going to talk about here in a little bit is autumn olive, for instance, which is an exotic invasive shrub that at the same time fixes nitrogen. It's very high in lycopene, which is a fairly unusual compound that's really health supportive for prostate issues, which is one of the most important issues of older men in our society. And so there's like, I've gotten into these dialogues about people are like, well, with this, aren't the pros more than the cons? And in particular with the autumn olive, it's more invasive in certain areas than others. Although once again, with climate change and things like that, we might not really have a full or I might not, I guess I'll say, have full perspective about that. Anyway, Nancy Gifts, Cornell trained biologist who's written this great book about the virtues of a messy lawn and learning to love the plants that we don't plant. Got dandelion on the cover there, and there's a great chapter about those. Dow Orion is another presenter in this series, did an incredible presentation that y'all could check out more. But really, I think probably more than most people, one of the biggest actors in this space over the last few years to kind of publicize this intensity of this war against these things that are potentially actually even helpful for us. And then of course you have tons of plant books about how to get rid of these things, like this Eradicate Invasive Plants by Chase. Okay, so thinking about exotic invasive medicinals in particular, this is kind of like a greatest hits list that I came up with for the US, and I'm not gonna really speak to these, and that's by no means like at all comprehensive, certainly of medicinal plants, or even just like what I would consider kind of top priority medicinals. And I'm going to go through some slides that look at plants by their different growth forms that will speak to a lot of these. So I'll just leave that up there so that all the names are all in one place, but we'll leave that at that. The two pictures being top left kudzu. One of my favorite articles that I think really speaks to the kudzu is something you could find through the Smithsonian. If you Google Smithsonian kudzu and the vine that never really ate the South, it's an amazing article that really shows how mischaracterized kudzu has been in its extent of coverage compared to a lot of other problematic plants, like say honeysuckle or privet, for instance, or multiflora. And there are whole books that are all about kudzu, and it's amazing. It's in all the different uses of it. Then bottom right, you have a type of barberry that's a very common ornamental that has very powerful medicinal compounds called berberine, alkaloid called berberine, named after berberis. And this is something that is often sought after in the form of golden seal. Right? Golden seal is a native threatened and endangered medicinal plant that is kind of one of the kind of iconic plants of United Plant Savers, the nonprofit that I'm part of. And so this is, I think, a cheap example of where I'm going with a lot of this is like the idea that we have a native endangered threatened plant that people are over harvesting for a compound. And then we have an overabundant, quote unquote, exotic invasive plant that has that compound too. So we can kind of like solve two problems at once, right? By stopping harvesting the native one that's not common and starting to harvest much more the exotic invasive one, which is quote unquote too common, right? Now, I do want to be clear that the chemistry of barberry is not exactly the same as the chemistry of golden seal. Golden seal has other compounds and higher amounts of some compounds than barberry. So it's not like, an exact one-to-one kind of exchange, but it's definitely kind of the general direction I'd like to see people head. And Timothy Lee Scott, the author of this book, Invasive Plant Medicine, is probably one of the best folks in this space to kind of take on a lot of these plants that are listed to the left and really cite a lot of the literature that looks into the medicinal compounds that they possess, and then talk to their potential applications due to those compounds. And then a man that I consider kind of my intellectual grandpa, Dr. Jim Duke, along with another amazing author, Stephen Foster, wrote this Peterson's Field Guide to Medicinal Plants and Herbs. And so that's going to contain a lot of these plants. And oftentimes it'll talk about some of the relatives of those plants too, and how they are used in other places besides the US as well. And according to the scientific literature review of Dr. Duke, who worked for the USDA for decades, and Stephen Foster is quite a scholar as well. So this kind of gets back into some of the work that I did looking at the specific exotic invasives of the Southern Appalachian region. As I said, there's about 300 or so of them, and within that, about 76 families. But 40 families only had one species represented, whereas 11 families had 178 species. So over half the total was just from 11 families. And actually a third of the total was just from 3 families, right? So we're talking the Poaceae, also known as the grass family, the Asteraceae, also known as the sunflower family, or the Fabaceae, also known as the bean or pea family. Going to have a third of the total, right? So if you're looking at bringing in new plants into habitat, if they are members of those 3 families, then that is definitely something to have some due diligence about their potential to spread. And right after that's the mint family, or the Lamiaceae, as it's set out here, that a lot of people know the potential for them to be invasive, but once again, more locally in your garden than like going to escape out into the woods. Although some, like shisho, would be an example I know around Maryland, DC, that kind of area. Perilla is an issue in that way, for instance. So thinking about the form of the plants, this is all from Exotic Invasives of the Southeast by Miller et al. And so they distinguished 9 forms. And out of those, forbs, grasses, shrubs, and vines represented 80% of the total of the exotic invasives. And aquatic species, not so much number-wise, but by space, a huge amount, and also by time. A lot of them were introduced fairly recently, but they've exploded in extent. So these are the kind of dynamics that you need to tease apart when you're talking about exotic invasive, at the individual level, versus like just lumping them all together as some monolithic group. And really thinking about this relation of form to extent, coverage, and economic effect, I think it's some of the best work that still remains to be done out there. So moving more towards this idea of food preparation, oftentimes I have historically, not as much anymore, taught a class called Forage and Feast. This is a class focused on wild edible plants. Of course, a lot of wild edible plants are exotic invasives. And in all of those classes, I would always make these 3 things, right? We would always have a dip, we would always have some dressing and a salad, and we would always make a tea. Okay, and I think of this as some of the most approachable type of food choice applications that people can bring into even like a mainstream setting, like the big game weekend, chips and dip kind of situation. And are just very simple to prepare as well. And at my website, Botany Every Day, I have a handout also under the resources about major useful plant families. And within that handout are recipes for all these things if people are interested. You can also Google me and Mountain Express and see a little short video I did on making pesto that has a lot of cool pictures of quite a number of exotic invasives. And these things aren't in and of themselves going to be fermented, but there can be a fermented aspect to them. In particular with my dips and my dressings, I often like to add miso to them to make them more probiotic. And of course, miso is the product of fermentation. And then you have, just so much realm as far as the teas goes to then turn that tea into something else fermented, like a soda or like an alcohol type of thing, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. So in the pictures, you have cucumber, wild green pesto, and then a wineberry. Wineberry is one of our exotic invasive raspberries, Rubus funiculaceus, that actually I was taught by a 3-year-old over 2 decades ago, and was one of the major reasons for me moving to the area where I live now, Asheville, North Carolina. I was at this eco village called Earth Haven, and the 3-year-old said, "You want to go pick wineberries?" And we went and picked wineberries, and it was amazing. And I said, I want to live in a place where 3-year-olds are this badass. So that being said, I've continued on very far since then. And there's another pesto that is there. It really kind of also shows an educational component to it. So this is from a big farm conference that has happened in the area annually, and I'd make this kind of taste of spring dip that would accompany the reception of that conference. And then surrounding that dip are all the plants that went into the dip with the scientific names and common names of the plants labeled, kind of like a little mini botanical gardens. So these are ways, I think, to really kind of get the word out in a visceral, tangible manner versus as much as it's amazing looking at these screens and, even reading books or whatever it might be. There's nothing like the taste, the smell, the sight, all of those different senses kind of combining together into one experience. So thinking about fermentation and ways that we could potentially apply exotic invasive plants within that frame, you have different breads like sourdough, of course, people would be familiar with. Maybe less familiar things like dosas and idlis, which are fermented lentil and rice type of preparations out of India. But you could be putting wild edibles, exotic invasives as your flavoring components in this regard. Although there are wild grains, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, that could potentially be applied to bread as well. All sorts of different tonics. I'm sure everybody's heard of vinegar and probably a good bit kombucha, maybe less so things like John or kvass or water kefir or rejuvelac. But these are all, I think, also, I just want to say potential business opportunities, right? I feel like that every single community needs to have, just like we have bakeries at this point, they kind of died out, but I think most communities now, once again, have the baker, the local baker. And then lots of places, especially more liberal places, college towns and whatnot, have the local kombucha maker, right? But this idea of making vinegar, making John, kvass, water kefir, and rejuvelac, which I don't think I'm going to unpack in the interest of time what that means, but just suffice it to say, those could all be individual products. And of course, you could, you don't just have one bakery. I mean, we probably have 20 bakeries in Nashville, and we have multiple people making kombucha for that matter. But even us, we're kind of lagging. I mean, I think we have almost all of these covered to some degree, other than maybe the kvass. And there are commercial kvasses out there, but we're not one of them currently. Then you get into alcohol. Probably everybody knows alcohol, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because I'm going to really get more into the beverages aspect here shortly. But then vegetables, sauerkrauts, and kimchis, basically fermenting greens in an anaerobic way. And I certainly incorporate lots of exotic invasives both as the greens and as the flavoring component. And similarly with pickles, whether you're fermenting them in a crock like you would sauerkraut or kimchi, or doing them with vinegar, you could be pickling wild things, or you could be using those things to flavor the other things you're pickling. And similar with the idea of tempehs and tamaris and misos, I mean, this is made out of soy. That's not an exact invasive, but I definitely know, like, if you're going to make anything yourself, why make it like it's just like the plain thing at the store? Like, tailor it to fit. Bring your sense of place into the mix. So that's the way you could do this. Also, I just wanted to mention that these are ferments that happen through the process of mold microbes, versus most fermentation tends to be more bacterial in focus. And then you have the dairy ferments, and of course, some cheeses are also the product of mold ferments as well. Moving to specifics around the probiotic beverages, you've got kefir, which gets confusing because you have a dairy version, you have a water version. Even within the water version, you have two different lineages. It's interesting because we have some Eastern European and other European people here. My understanding is there's this lineage that comes out of Europe. It's sometimes called the root beer plant, but it's not a plant, it's a microbe. And then you have a lineage that comes out of Latin America called tibicos. But they're typically conflated under this title of water kefir, even though the culture, the SCOBY, the symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast look different. Yeah, John basically is kombucha that you use honey instead of sugar to sweeten the liquid. For anybody that's not familiar, of course, kraut juice, you just like drain the juice off, and now people are selling kraut juice, you know, as a tonic. And kvass, it gets confusing too. Once again, this is a big thing coming out of Eastern Europe. And I think of, at least in my community and maybe the US more generally, when people hear kvass, they think of Sally Fallon, the book Nourishing Traditions, and this recipe she had for making beet kvass. But I was actually just at a big international conference with some Eastern Europeans, and they definitely disabused me of the idea that like kvass is definitely more a bread thing, typically. Suffice it to say, it's a fermented beverage. It's kind of like a soda. There are commercial products that you can even buy in the US at specialty grocers, but nothing that I've seen on the market besides that. And I'd be interested in any input people might have about kvass, what that term means. But moving on to vinegar, you can make vinegar pretty much from any kind of sweet liquid. No, people are familiar with kind of rice wine vinegar or grape vinegar or apple cider vinegar, but certainly kind of any fruit, or you could be using sugar or honey for your sweetener, and then add other things to make the vinegar. And then from the vinegar, you can make amazing things like fire cider, which a lot of people know, but then these more obscure things like oxymels and shrubs and switchels. Oxymels, in my kind of estimation, typically being more of a savory thing. Shrubs typically being more of like a fruit and vinegar and sweet thing. And then switchels having molasses involved as part of the sweetening process. But these are some examples of some various different products that various different people in various different states of the Union. Let's see, Virginia, Georgia, and North Carolina at a minimum, and Florida represented. And once again, every community needs to have all of these things on tap. And these are things that are going to be proofed against like, export to some foreign entity or that kind of thing, because it's like the local terroir. It's of definition something that can't be replicated elsewhere because it's of that place, right? And I think that we really need to lean into that a lot more, especially with the challenges that we face coming up as far as supply chain shortages and access to even basic resources. Right after air and water is food. Of course, we were just talking about beverages, so that's the liquid part of our basic needs right after air. Thinking about beer, this is definitely not as important as water, but some people certainly love it a lot, myself included. And it's interesting, you have hops that are famous, right? And there's this law that I think it's even 500, it's either 400 or 500 years old, coming out of Germany, that said beer can only be barley, hops, water, and yeast. And there's some interesting dialogues around why hops, of all the hundreds of plants they could have chosen and even had a tradition of being used at that time, like yarrow or alehoof, also known as ground ivy, Glaucoma heteracea, lots of things, or nettles, for instance, as I have up here. But there are some people that are getting into the exotic invasive space with brewing. Primarily in my area, you have this brewery called Fonte Flora, and they've made a kudzu beer, as you can see in the top middle. They've made multiple dandelion beers, you can see at the top right. And then you even have a bigger brewery like New Belgium, which was originally out of Colorado, but actually their East Coast operations are here in Asheville. And they've made a dandelion beer as well, which they actually use the Dutch name, and I'm half Dutch, so that really tickled me. Paardebloem is how you pronounce that. Paard is a horse, so basically, and bloom is flower, so horse flower, for anybody that's wondering. But you have a number of other great breweries. They're doing unusual things. It's kind of been mentioned in this series by other people, but this kind of interesting idea around exotic, invasive, native, invasive, right? And some people, they just won't use the word invasive for native things, but I think we're all familiar, like, that there are certain plants that are native that can really run roughshod over everything. Poison ivy, that I like to call sister ivy as well. Texicodendron radicans is an example. In my own native garden, where I'm trying to, I probably have close to 80, 90 different species of plants in a space that's like a couple hundred feet by a couple hundred feet. There's a native plant called wingstem, which Verbicina, or Actinomerus being the genus, which is just, it's like such a bully, right? So anyway, there's some of these kind of plants that are native that have been used by some of these people. And one of the ones that came to mind that probably isn't as invasive as we might like because of its antiviral properties is elderberry. So that can definitely be sometimes invasive in certain areas, but it is native, right? And so this kind of gets tricky as far as like terminology. I'm really big with my brewing in making honey wine, also known as mead, and I've used over 200 species of plants and fungi in that regard. There's some really neat names for certain special kinds of mead. So a mead made with maple syrup, for instance, would be an Acer Glen. Acer is the scientific name for maples. That's the genus name. And there is an exotic invasive maple, which is the Norway maple. And trees in general, much less exotic invasive than the more herbaceous plants. Braggot is mead that's made with grains. So you could be using exotic invasive grains in that regard. Melomels, made with fruit. Metheglins have medicinal components. A rhizomel contains roots, and a rhodomel contains roses. And you have, the exotic invasive rose issue for sure that could potentially be applied in that regard. So yeah, as far as mead goes, there's a lot less meaderies than there are breweries. I would say with the breweries, there's about 1,000 microbreweries, basically, mostly. I mean, 8,000 total breweries, but most of them are small ones, right? But there's like hundreds of meaderies, right? So it's a much less competitive space, and some places don't have meaderies at all. Us being Asheville, we have 3 in our tiny little town, but a lot of places have none. Speaking about grasses, I mentioned that they are some of the most invasive of the planet, and I think a lot of people will be familiar with bamboo in that regard. As far as cold areas, it's typically more going to be the Arundinaria genus that is going to be cold hardy and invasive versus more tropical places where bambusa and lots of other things would take over. But you have these things, once again, poisoned so much by our society so often, and yet they have like even a history as an agricultural product. They just kind of lost the race to get big or get out in regards to crabgrass and foxtail millet. And then you have things like silvergrass and stiltgrass, which are definitely some of our most challenging grasses in my area, especially the stiltgrass, in that it is shade tolerant. One thing that we did as a kind of experiment proof of concept, because the grass family is typically very safe, is we started juicing some of these things. And it was actually interesting, the flavor of the stiltgrass juice. So for anybody that's super into doing wheatgrass and that kind of thing, because it does kind of take a special juicer. You can't just use like a champion or something. That could be, I think, that underexplored area, trying all those different grasses and what their juices taste like, and even what the chemistry is of that juice and those kinds of things. So thinking about using flowers, I like to work with this concept that people eat with their eyes as well as their mouth. I've also coined this term that maybe I can eventually get into a book form, which is called botanical bling. But basically, there's tons of plants out there that if you can't use anything, at least you can use the flowers to provide beauty, right? So these are some examples. I have recently read about wisteria potentially being poisonous, although lots of people do consume it. But that's a qualifier out of the work of Julia Morton, who's a PhD from down in Florida. It was in Poisonous Plants of Florida book, and I hadn't really seen that in other places. So have a little pause. I almost took it out of the slide, but I figured I would just qualify it. I would say also with the daylily that some people are a little bit sensitive to the daylily, and when even when they eat the flower petals, they will get a little bit of that kind of classic scratchiness in the back of the throat. That's kind of like an allergy kind of thing. I've never heard of anything major, like anaphylactic shock or something, but definitely kind of irritating. Although every single part of this plant, for the most part, at least the flowers, the buds, the tubers, and the early shoots, have a tradition of being consumed for thousands of years out of Asia. Everybody is going to have a violet of some sort where they are in the world, for the most part, where it's cold. And lots of different ones. People tend to say that they can be used interchangeably. Although I have heard, at least anecdotally, some people say the yellow violets seem to be a little bit more intense to consume. Yeah, gosh, right now it's all about Rosa Sharon. That's probably my number one edible flower of this time of year in our area, and it's planted very commonly in a lot of places. And it is one of these ones that, like, I did landscaping for a couple years, and we would find like the little babies under the shrubs. We find lots of little babies under the shrubs, but I've never found a Rosa Sharon in the middle of the woods or something like that. So it will kind of spread locally, but not like super far. Typically, lots of different colors. Also, lots of great medicine in there. I think of prebiotics and kind of thing that feeds your good microbes, your microbiome, that you can often find from the mallow family that the Rosa Sharon is part of. Now, I definitely bears mentioning, of course, that there are poisonous things out there, and this isn't really a foraging class, but I guess it just bears mentioning that the classic saying is, "When in doubt, leave it out." If you don't have proper identification, then you need to just stop right there. And so one kind of way of going about that is to rule out what are the poisonous plants in your area. And these would certainly be some of the cast of characters that you might be concerned of. And I think I'm going to leave that at that. We've got this Elaeagnus genus, which comprises things like autumn olive and gumi, as demonstrated here. But there's also a number of other things from that genus and even other genera, and actually some things that are native. But this is the one that I was mentioning that fixes nitrogen, very high in lycopene, and just super easy to pick a super large amount very quickly too. The gumi is a lot better taste, the one on the left, than the autumn olive in the middle. And the gumi is actually ready much earlier too, like the season's already over, and the autumn olive is ready in autumn. But gosh, man, I remember picking just gallons of autumn olives like in like 40 minutes just by kind of shaking them with a tarp underneath, making kind of jams and jellies and wines and whatnot. Yeah, things like the quote unquote fall strawberries, and the wineberry that I mentioned earlier from the rose family. Rose family is definitely the number one family in the world for fruits in cold places. In cold places of the world, most of your fruits are going to be in the rose family. There are definitely some outliers, like the autumn olive is in its own family. The Elaeagnaceae, persimmons are in the ebony family, and pawpaws are in their own family. So there are some outliers that way, but when we're talking about most of the fruits of the cold world, your apples, your pears, your plums, your cherries, your raspberries, your blackberries, your hawthorns, your service berries, on and on. It's that lovely rose family that Thinking of exotic invasive spring greens, some of these are going to be commonly known by a lot of people. I think the hostas might be the most outlierish of any of them, especially if you're not from Europe, where it seems like that's really gaining a lot more parlance. But my teacher, Frank Cook, first turned me on to that coming out of where he was doing his master's degree in London. And there's a ton of different kinds of hostas. A lot of different species have a tradition of being consumed. There's this great term in Japan called sansai, which basically translates to wild mountain vegetables. There's a whole practice around eating a meal of sansai as a spring ritual, and hostas are part of that. And they are one that I do find occasionally a little bit into the woods, but they certainly will spread a lot on people's land when they're planted sometimes. You get into the Japanese knotweed, which really could be a whole talk unto itself, and there is a whole talk in the series in that fertilizer. But yeah, suffice to say, every single part is potentially useful. The roots more for medicine, the shoots more as a kind of like rhubarb substitute, as shown here. So like I do a strawberry Japanese knotweed crisp, you know, instead of strawberry rhubarb crisp, for instance, in the spring. Flowers, very good for pollinators. The plant itself is a natural dye. You can certainly use it within fermented food aspect, all of in regards to making wines or making sauerkrauts and those kinds of applications. Oh man, whole book on dandelions called Dandelion Celebration comes through, and I actually have a whole talk on dandelions that's like kind of distracting me right now. So I'm going to just turn the page and move on and say that pigweed, which I mentioned already, but goes by a lot of different names. Maybe anybody familiar with the Caribbean might be tickled if they didn't know already that that's also callaloo. You have quickweed, which is one of the few things I was having a talk with the organizers before the start about this phenomenon. Being half European and having spent a lot of time in Europe, I've been fascinated that we have hundreds of species of plants in the US that have been introduced from Europe and Asia that are exotic invasives. But it doesn't seem like that goes the same way backwards. Like I can literally maybe count on two hands what are the major exotic invasives from the US and Europe. But this would be one of them, quickweed, although this is definitely something that you might even see sold at markets in Central America. It's one of my favorite greens to cook with of the hot times of the year when a lot of the spring greens go away. And yeah, just to flesh out a little bit more of that reverse exotic invasivism, I would say the black locust, Robinia pseudoacacia, and poke, Phytolacca americana, are some of the other major invasives over in Europe that are native here. I mentioned the shisha already and how bad that is kind of in the mid-Atlantic, but then it's not quite like that here for whatever reason up in the mountains, although I have seen it spread locally at times. Certainly this lamb's quarter in particular, this is Chenopodium giganteum, variety magenta spreen, this purple lamb's quarter is at the bottom left. You can just see there, I mentioned one plant can make 50,000 seeds, and you see like just in that frame, there's probably 50 plants, you know, but an incredible green related to spinach, all sorts of great applications. And then you've got purslane that a lot of people would know that even grows also in the tropics. And in particular, it's claimed to fame being higher in the essential fatty acids that people go after fish for, or evening primrose oil for. So we have it in the form of this overly abundant wild edible plants in regards to purslane. Thinking about the roots, we've got burdock on the left, top and bottom, and every single part, potential application. The roots, though, probably the more famous thing for food, in particular in Japanese cooking, there's a term called gobo, I think in other parts of Asia too, actually, from some recent teaching I was doing. And yeah, then as you go up above, though, it's much less so. Like, for instance, you do see that these flowers are attractive to honeybees, for instance, and certainly use those sticky balls to like kind of replicate Velcro with your friends or something like that. But yeah, it's definitely more the root. Some people do pickle the stems of burdock. I have heard of that application, although they're pretty bitter. And yellow dock would be kind of similar in that regard. It's the greens of yellow dock are much more choice than the pretty much inedible leaves of, or the just way too bitter leaves of the burdock. And yeah, I think of comfrey is like one that has a tradition of intake internally for lots of different reasons, and even being eaten as a vegetable. But it does have pyrolyzing alkaloids that are a more recent understanding that I think would preclude the use of comfrey except for very short-term types of applications. Like it's called bone knit, for instance, and some people would drink comfrey tea if they had a broken bone for a short span of time. But certainly any kind of regular use of comfrey or other things containing pyrolyzing alkaloids, I would tend to want to dissuade anyone from. And then you have teasel, which is a really potent medicinal that could definitely be overdone. It used to be in its own family, the Dipsaceae, now it's in the Caprifoliaceae. Traditionally used to tease fibers, right? So that's like the real, like card wool, that kind of thing. But definitely making medicine from the roots is low dose, very powerful. I think a lot of people know valerian is one of the more common ones to help people sleep. Thinking about all these different ones. So this is kind of pushing the bounds for me. This is kind of like the area that I'm like moving towards versus what I've already kind of like fully grokked and understood. At the bottom, you have barberry, which I mentioned already, and the closely related Oregon grape, which used to go by Mahonia, but now goes, I think, also by Berberis. And then we have the Rose of Sharon. Once again, you can kind of just see in a different form. But then you go up, you have Japanese Spirea. Spirea, very famous genus for basically a similar chemistry to aspirin, right? And this Japanese Spirea, I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole a little bit with Google Scholar and peer-reviewed scientific literature and whatnot. It does feel like that there is some potential application for medicine. It is definitely one of the most challenging exotic invasive shrubs in the botanical sanctuary that I do a lot of my work here in Asheville. So I'm really questing for a potential application for it. And if anybody wants to pick that up in the spirit of reciprocity, because I tell you, I have like way more questions than time to answer them in regards to things like this. And another one would be butterfly bush, which I don't find to be super invasive in our area, but I know it can be somewhat invasive, at least in some areas. But I also know from my travels in South America that this is a plant that they do use medicinally. I'm not sure necessarily within the realm of internal intake. I think it's more of a topical thing. And so I don't know exactly where it would overlap with fermentation, the extrapolation, but I just had to leave it in there because maybe somebody would get excited and look into it and get back to me or something, because that's way, way, way down on the list of things I might want to look into. And this is kind of similar with the privets, right? So there's some really famous privets, but more like Ligustrum lucidum, which doesn't grow in this area. It's much more of a kind of warm, so like deeper in the south kind of thing. And this is more like Ligustrum sinensis or vulgaris or something. But this idea of analogs, right? So if one species has potential application, oftentimes you might extrapolate that other species will have those applications, but not always. And a great example is on the bottom there with the honeysuckles, because there are honeysuckles, have a tradition even of eating the fruit, typically the blue fruited ones, typically under the name honeyberry. Like a Linicera cerulea, maybe, I think would be a species, although there are a number of different species. But then apparently there are poisonous honeysuckles too. And unlike a lot of poisonous things, apparently the honeysuckles actually taste good, because most poisonous things, they warn you. They're actually bitter or spicy or prickly or something. It's like, don't eat me, but apparently these are not that. And of course, some people do eat the flowers. Honeysuckles, it's one of the first plants I learned as a child living in Alabama. I was maybe like 6 years old, taking out that little nectar from the honeysuckle flower, and I could just spend an hour just like flower after flower, just So that's, the volume of consumption, that's not going to hurt you. We're talking about Lonicera japonica, though specifically. And so I don't know that you could extrapolate that, and I wouldn't probably extrapolate it without some former and prior information from where these things are native to do that even with the flowers of some of these exotic invasive honeysuckles. And lastly, I would just say that a lot of the exotic invasive honeysuckles are shrubs, right, versus the Lonicera japonica, which is a vine. And then you lastly have burning bush, which I really have no frame for. It's mostly poisonous family, also related to Oriental bittersweet, but I do feel like there's medicine in there. And so once again, I left it in the mix, but I don't have anything definitive to say about it. As I mentioned, the teas are going to be one of the easiest things you can do, right? Just pick the plants, put them in water. These are going to be some of the more common things that you would find. I think the mullein and the ale hoof more just like everywhere. And then the lemon balm, the anisissup, and the motherwort more locally within people's gardens that have herb gardens. But man, the story that each one of these plants carries is almost overwhelming just looking at them. And so much so that, especially given the time, I'm just going to kind of leave it at that and suffice it to say that they're all ones to get familiar with to whatever degree that you are able. Thinking about invasive trees, you've got Tree of Heaven. And this is a really fascinating one. And the Tree of Heaven actually lived in North America historically and then went extinct long before people even got here. And then now people have brought it back. And this is the one people call Tree of Hell. But I have to say, something that has a priority of being here like millions of years ago, and now it's just like returned. Although I will say the evidence for that so far has only been from the West Coast out in California. I'm not sure that it was native in the East as of yet. But yeah, it's just weird sometimes. Like, I mean, especially this is one that really does just grow in pretty disturbed areas, like really hardcore, almost nothing else could grow, road cuts and things like that. A more recent twist in it is that there is this lantern fly for that apparently is the new next coming of catastrophic insect invasion across our flora. And unlike a lot of insect invaders, say like the hemlock adelgid that just specifically focuses on that one thing, apparently the lanternfly eats a whole bunch of things. So that's a bit problematic, but I will say that the Tree of Heaven are even more than a bit problematic, just to put it lightly. But the Tree of Heaven is from this super famous family for antiparasitics. More of a tropical thing, but pretty much anywhere in the world that I've been and seen a member of this family growing, people are like, that's some of our big medicine for anti-parasites. And parasites are a huge scourge in our society as well. That's not just for poor places. And Timothy Lee Scott takes this one on and looks a lot at the chemistry and the literature if you're interested. Mimosa on the top right being a plant that's also called the happy tree. So basically a potential antidepressant. It's another one that is interesting habitat-wise regarding invasion. Up here in the mountains, it's fairly sporadic. But then if you just go like an hour down into the Piedmont, then it like really expands as you get into a warmer habitat. So then with climate change, as the mountains get warmer, then is it going to expand up here? These are the kinds of things that we need to kind of be thinking about. But flowers and bark are used in regards to the mimosa. And then you have something like a Bradford pear, which is an exotic invasive that actually does make an edible fruit, although it's like super tiny. But then I have folks that are now moving in this way around guerrilla grafting, where they'll like cut down those Bradford pears and then put like nicer pears that like are more the full size ones that we would appreciate to eat further. But that being said, I would say that the flowers of the rose family are great edibles. I probably wouldn't hesitate to use the flowers of practically any member of that family, especially if it has a fruit that's used for food, for ornamentation. Vines, you have more obscure things like the chocolate vine and the sweet tea vine, but these fall under the umbrella of this term adaptogens. There's a great book by author named David Winston. Okay, I just saw I got muted, but not muted. I think I'm good now. And we're coming down the mountain, just so you know. So yeah, we're going to be wrapping up here shortly. But you have the chocolate vine, the sweet tea vine, adaptogens, David Winston, another author named Donald Yance. I think David Winston has a nice free PDF on his website. Didn't want to. Then you have something like hot tuna, which is a common landscape ornamental that can easily escape. It's often planted in the form that's at the top, where it's like yellow and green and pink, but then when it naturalizes, it goes back to more the straight green form that you can see below. Smells kind of like fishy, called hot tuna in part, I think, for that reason. Definitely a tradition of using it medicinally, though, in the places where it comes from. Makes me think of the incredible database. Well, it makes me think of a number of databases. I guess I'll just put up there. One is Plants for a Future, PFAF, and they have thousands of plants that they kind of run down in a monograph form, talking about the potential uses and citing the sources of the information where it came from. Another one would be for the indigenous uses of plants, and that could be a fascinating study. I mentioned the Cherokee earlier, which I'm familiar with, but to what degree are there indigenous traditions with exotic invasive plants could be a fascinating thesis or dissertation. But one way to go about looking into that somewhat would be the database by Dan Moorman. It's the Native American Ethnobotany database you could put into your search engine. And then lastly, I would just mention Dr. Jim Duke, who I mentioned earlier with the Medicinal Plants of Eastern North America book, but he also has a database for phytochemistry. And I've mentioned a number of different compounds like the pyrrolysine alkaloids and comfrey, or yeah, we're going to mention some others too. But that being said, you could put a compound into Dr. Duke's phytochemical database, and the plants that are known to have that compound would come up. Or you could put a plant that you're interested in potentially consuming, and then the known compounds that are in that plant would come up, especially if you're in a family that has potentially toxic compounds. That's definitely part of my due diligence process in that regard. I think everybody knows tomatoes, but it's interesting. Like, I tried to grow tomatoes for so many years. Actually, when I first moved to this area in '99, I lived on a organic tomato farm. We grew over 40 different varieties in a very hardcore, very hard to do way. And so I've pretty much given up at this point in trying to grow the strain. I guess they changed the name. I guess it's Solanum lycopersicum is the scientific name for tomatoes now. But this is a different species, I think, Pipinifolia. And this grows of its own accord, just comes up every year by itself. It's actually smaller than a cherry tomato. It's like really tiny, but super flavorful. And so in the place where I've lived for the last 6.5 years, this is the tomato I go with because it doesn't get the blight. It also doesn't take time, energy, fertilizer, weeding, or any other type of inputs as well. Japanese honeysuckle is something that's been talked about in the series by other people. I think in particular, Alyssa, you took this one on in your medicinal talk. Suffice it to say, super antiviral, in particular the unopened flower buds being the most famous in a formula called yin chow in Chinese medicine. Okay, let's see. So here we are. We're at our conclusions. One underutilized means of controlling exotic invasive plants, both recognized and not, is to use them for a variety of novel industries. Industry, man, I got to change that word. But anyway, many of the plants listed as exotic invasives can be used for food, medicine, or as resources for other activities. Ton of other research besides what I've already mentioned. What is the economic and social viability of pursuing the uses? How effective are harvesting practices in relation to controlling the target species? And certainly just to put out there that a nightmare for me would be to like promote the use of exotic invasives, have people go out there and harvest them and spread them in the process of harvesting, right? So if you have something that has like a lot of fruits and you're like dragging it out of the forest and dropping fruits as you go, then that's really kind of defeating the purpose, right? So in your harvesting regime, you want to make sure not to be a vector for further spread, unless that's how you roll. I mean, that's something I haven't really covered in this talk about people that are like super pro exotic invasives, and they're like, man, we're about to run out of resources. We're about to be on lockdown, and we need to bring the most powerful plants of the world to our location that we can use no matter what now, while we have access to easy travel and cheap oil and all these types of things. But I digress. What other uses might be identified? Tons, man. If somebody could pay me to like spend, months, let alone a year of my life, I mean, it's just like being incredible. The book and even just the research paper that could come out of like the hundreds of different uses that are still probably not known by me. But as I've mentioned already, what's the correlation between the form of the plant and the area affected? What will be the effect of climate change on exotic invasives? How much area does each species cover? I remember getting my minor in geography in grad school. We did geographic information systems mapping of the potential for the spread of kudzu, for instance, with climate change, because as you know that it's like not tolerant of super cold places. You can kind of like delimit where it is now versus where it might be in the future. And that could be done with all of these things. Although that was such a painful lab for me personally, looking at that screen that much. Once again, I digress. Coming down the mountain, we research into the development of more biological controls. Although, of course, I didn't mention this before, that this has certainly happened where you have an exotic invasive organism, you bring in another exotic organism to control that one, and either it doesn't do what you thought it would do, or it actually becomes a secondary problem, right? And so that whole science of biological control is littered with that, unfortunately. But nonetheless, I think it is one of the tools in the toolbox, and it's certainly something that people are doing, no matter what. What is the best way to restore the reclaimed sites once the exotic invasives are out of there? Because nature adores a vacuum. If you create space, you either need to fill it intentionally or something else is going to fill it for you. And then what is the best way to inform the public? I hope that this has been one example of that. And I really appreciate your interest. And I see there's a ton in the chat. I haven't gotten to check that yet, but these are a few other resources. All this stuff would be at my website, botanyeveryday.com, under the exotic invasive plant class too. But suffice it to say, the top 3 lines are more about identification and control. And then eat the invasivore and foragers harvest are more about making awesome things from these things that you're trying to control. The Ground Shots podcast with Kelly Moody speaks to this problem of exotic invasives, or this potential solution, represented by exotic invasives in a number of different podcasts. And Matthew Chu is one of her guests, but he has a ton of information, very well researched in the academic space on this subject. And lastly, Patterson Clark is another crafter with exotic invasives and has the site Alien Weeds. We did it. Woo! Me and the automologist.
Yeah. Yeah, that was so great. Thank you. It's so much knowledge, so much specificity, and yeah, so much research. So wonderful, especially to get all that botany. We really haven't in this series just.
Yeah, I was stoked to have that piece because you covered so many amazing things. But yeah, that was, I thought, one of the things I could really bring to the fore.
Yeah, so great. We have lots of questions. So I mean, really, we'll do like, I guess, a half an hour of questions. Is that what you were thinking? Yeah. Okay,
sure.
Or however long it takes.
Yeah,
but,
however long it goes.
I think a half an hour for people, just to let people know. So yeah, I mean, one of the first questions was, and I think you kind of addressed this because it was an early question, but I think David was just wondering about U.S. biomes, and he said most of what we're covering is sort of northeast or northwest, or but anything that really covers the southwest regions, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to my class, I do it. South Africa, like Australia, I try anything I can get from the literature is in there. And I definitely have a bunch for the desert Southwest. I also have a whole class on the desert Southwest specifically that then would also incorporate the idea of exotic invasives. So yeah, I mean, I'm based in the Southeast, but a lot of these plants you're going to find in the Southwest, in the Northwest, the Northeast, in Asia, anywhere where it's cold.
Awesome. Yeah, so many, that's so great. Does anyone actually want to unmute themselves and just sort of, I mean, yeah, I mean, I I want to make sure people get their questions in who sort of put them in early, but I would really encourage everyone to just shout them out.
Hi, thanks for lecturing. Sorry, I'm a little undressed, so I turn off my video, but I'm wondering, I'm super interested in edible landscape, and in a way, I realize sometimes invasive species are already out there. So I was wondering if there's any way to raise awareness of whether it's edible invasive species or is toxic invasive species, or is it like, is there any like education program that was already out there to benefit the public? Thanks.
Okay, and what location are you?
Seattle, Washington.
Oh, in Seattle. Okay. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, Seattle, I would definitely turn you on to John Kalis. His last name is Kallas, and he actually did his PhD at the University of Michigan in wild edible plants like decades ago. And
okay.
he's a big forager. I think he's closer to Portland, but as far as the Pacific Northwest goes, he would be a major one. You know, somebody else, I can't believe I got through this whole talk without mentioning him. His name is Pascal Baudard. I think it's kind of pronounced, but it's spelled, his last name is Baudar. And he's actually would be a big overlap with the desert Southwest, but also potentially the Pacific Northwest, because he's kind of based out of LA and has some really incredible books from, I think it's Chelsea Green, but also does classes online as well. As far as Seattle goes in general, I mean, there's amazing field guides and stuff. Beyond that, I think that's where you're kind of going to get into it, is the field guides. Lots of wild edible plant guides specifically. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, basically I'm proud in like interest, like if right now those invasive species just scatter around the places, but is that able to create a more sustainable or more constant yield throughout the year? Because I'm thinking about the future, maybe people, instead of go to grocery buying fruits, they can just go down the street, do some harvesting or something. Do you think that's practical? Is too ideal?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's practical. I do think there is this question, which I've really spent a ton of time of my life on answering, is the potential for toxicity that is occurring in urban environments to be uptaken by the plants that are in those environments. So there's starting to be some good research out of Berkeley and actually in Maryland. I think in Baltimore, I think they've done some interesting research, and you would see all this cited in my phytoremediation class as well, the potential for toxicity being taken up. That would be my big qualifier in harvesting urban areas. Short of the long of it is, in general, the thinking has been that, like, if plants gonna take up toxins, they'll be in the roots and that's it. If beyond the roots, the leaves, but then they typically don't put things in the fruits. So fruits in an urban environment would be the safest thing to harvest, right, by that. But some of the science that's looking into root vegetables potentially, or certainly leafy greens growing in urban environments that have pollution, they don't necessarily, just because the pollution's there doesn't mean that the plants are polluted, basically, is the the short of the long of it. But that is something to at least be aware of. And, you know, ideally I pick at organic farms, I pick in forests, I don't pick in urban places.
I see.
For that reason. But I do feel like most people live in cities now, and that's only going to increase as time goes on. So we do need to figure this out, because there's a ton of stuff there that could potentially be feeding folks if we just know that it's safe.
I see. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I think those are all important. I just wanted to mention, yeah, this shouldn't encourage people to go out and harvest from urban areas, but I do know Candace Thompson, friend of mine, also collaborator, but she actually tested at a Cornell lab spinach that she got from the grocery store, non-organic, and lamb's quarter from one of the most polluted neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And the spinach had more lead than the lamb's quarter. So shouldn't encourage, but I'm just saying, just to kind of throw that in the mix.
Yeah.
This is LB. Thank y'all so much for hosting and facilitating and presenting. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. And hey, Mark, I'm from Asheville too. From
Yeah.
you know my kudzu culture co-conspirators, Zev and
Yeah.
Justin, but I don't think we've met before.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. I'm surprised I didn't mention you actually. I love
Oh,
your
it's all
work.
good. I'm super annoying about kudzu all the time, so people already know. But one thing, this is like a part question, mostly a comment though. I keep going back to this distillation after these presentations, that like as far as an answer goes, of course there's no, the whole reason why we're having these conversations is that there is no right, wrong, black, white. You know, that's what's gotten us into a lot of this mess, is because historically the global north and colonizing people have thought that they know right and wrong, and then go all gung-ho about a certain plant, or, you know, like I'm in the kudzu narrative, but it applies to a lot of other plants. And then I see this kind of like second wave of that kind of mentality now happening with people who are so protective of native species that they're almost like reapplying that perfectionism. It's also kind of stemmed in like nocturnal rites fantasy rituals, where it's kind of like there is a distinct good and evil, and it's like a human can be elevated above nature to be like the savior, the protector, the hero, the like no, I know the answer, I'm gonna intervene. That mentality is just so limiting to like how to move through this time. Like what I experience sometimes is like, I'll just literally just mention the word kudzu and people will freak out. And it's like, whoa, slow down. Like, I'm not saying I'm going to plant kudzu on all of your plants and like have it take over, but there's this deeper psychology, and so much of it goes back to, like you were saying, Mark, the psycholinguistics and how to address all of this in like a holistic way. And that's why this education being first, like encouraging people to make products and all of that, like that gets people excited because money is sexy to some people, you know, but it's like how to emphasize the mentality and education, and that this is like, it's not like you like go just harvest whatever you want wherever you want and that it's always okay. So anyway, I guess like, what are some ideas from you and the group in terms of like, how do we create, like there are lots of networks, and this is what Alyssa and the Eclipta and Krater people are doing too, is like how to group more people together to talk about this in a holistic way, kind of like the way people already talk about protecting native species. Sorry, that became a lot of a ramble, but I just wanted to double down on the fact that education is so important as the container.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, I guess, put the term of ethic out there. You know, it's about ethics, and whether that's in protecting the natives or in reframing how we look at the exotic invasives. It's like about like a kinship. I mean, Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about these kinds of things. I just feel like that we're so like detached from how it all is part of this greater puzzle, right? And that we somehow are now driving the bus and like choosing, you know, who gets to be on the ark and who has to leave, you know. And so it's interesting because like I'm, for instance, teaching at this Colorway Native Plant Conference that's been happening for decades in this area here. And I've been just wrestling with how to go into that space, you know, and really like bring in this dialogue in a productive manner so that people can hear, right? Because I do feel like it is so loaded, and folks often just kind of shut down as soon as something they perceive to be a problem is entered into the conversation, and they just don't, you know, and I don't have the answer, but doing things like this, I'm so grateful to Alyssa and all your collaborators with this. I feel like this is what we have to do. It's just as many mediums as possible and as many frames to just kind of get it out there and have more long form discussion versus like the dumpster fires that happen on Facebook, you know, on like different discussion groups of like plant things. I think that's the exact opposite of what we need to do, you know, just like trolling and flaming and all that stuff. I do think it's more like these longer dialogues. It's not something you can cover in like, you know, just a line or two or a minute or two.
Yeah, that's so great. I struggle with that so much. Thanks for your question, LB. There's a question from Evan I just wanted to read because he says his mic doesn't work. The main interest in invasives surrounds the use of Ardisia crenata. I've learned that the leaves may contain a toxin at their edge, but that the berries may not. I have not been able to confirm nor deny the toxicity of the berries, though I have eaten up to 3 days without any obvious negative effects. The plant is incredibly prolific here, and the berries are known to contain several beneficial phytochemicals. Any input on this topic? And definitely thanks, Mark, for the class.
Wow, yeah, Evan, let's just talk offline. I know Evan, and that's like a Florida specific thing for our country, or at least like a pretty tropical plant. I do know there are edible Ardesias though. I think the native one, interesting, because there's a native Ardesia as well as this exotic invasive coral one. But I mean, that's pretty inside baseball, I guess is to say. So let's talk about that later. I think most people don't even know what Ardesia is.
Anybody else? Questions? There's so many other questions, but go for it. Anybody? Okay, sure.
And of course, you know, people, you can always follow up with me at botанyeveryday.com. My email is marc, my first name, at botанyeveryday.com. And I think a lot of the questions could potentially be further elucidated in that class that I mentioned that's at that same website on exotic invasives as well. Oh, Sunny Savage, don't you have something to say? I mean, what a hero. You are heroine or shero.
Sarah, I do have a question, and just that I haven't been very successful in fermenting our wild greens. I live in Hawaii, and I took Pascal Bardar's recent edible wild greens fermentation class, and then I started experimenting with some of my own. Of course, I've added, you know, into sauerkrauts and things like that with a lot of success. But I've been experimenting with, you know, just kind of straight wild greens and just haven't really cracked much into that realm. So anyways, yeah. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but it's very...
Okay. Yeah, I do. Two thoughts. One is straight wild greens. I've had issues as well, like depending on certain ones. Like I tried our Laportia, which is our native wood nettle, and it was not good. Like I don't know why. So I think there's like some chemistry or something. But another thing that I definitely noticed as well in my travels in the tropics is fermenting can be much harder in the tropics too. You know, there's just way more microbes, the temperature regulation. I would definitely say there's like process. Like I have friends in Florida that actually bury their stuff in the ground, you know, to kind of get the like ambient temperature from the ground instead of like from the air, to kind of like cool the process. So I think temperature and microbes are definitely going to potentially be a thing, but then it's going to also be a case-by-case basis. And these are the proof of concept things that people like you, I'm so grateful for, are like going after those individual things, you know, and trying, okay, does this one work? Does that one work? Does this one work? You know, that's the kind of stuff that we really need to be doing, straight batches of all of these different greens just by themselves. And I've kind of played around with that a little bit and definitely have noticed, like you said, some things definitely work better than others. But in general, I tend to, because like it's such a bummer when you spend all the time and energy, it doesn't work out. Like I often will do like 50% cabbage and, you know, kind of more straight typical things. And then I'll do like the other half augmented with like a mix of things. And I typically pretty much had success that way. But that's like precluding the whole tropical piece as well.
I just also just want to just add a little strength to anybody who is trying to do a business. I have personally run into a lot of resistance in my local community. I had a food truck that served invasive species. I was reported to the health department twice for serving invasive species. I've run into a lot of resistance from conservation organizations, you know, trying to write grants to utilize invasive edibles that, you know, they all love and support my work on a personal level, but as far as an organizational level, like no letters of support. The tides are absolutely changing, and, you know, somebody like myself to, you know, stick through it. I know it's not going to be as rough a ride for people coming down the pipeline, but just to really, like, you know, just stick with it, and the tides are changing if you're going to start a small business.
Well, I do want to just big up a little bit more, Sunny. I've just admired you from afar for so long, and anybody who's not aware, like definitely Google that name, and you've got so many cool videos. You also have the app that you worked on Wild Edibles, I know, and you know, traveled around the country, you know, also learned from Frank Cook, I know. And so please, people, just take note of that name if you're interested in this space, and especially in Hawaii and then more in the tropics, because I really did focus more on cold places. But I'd be happy to talk with you more directly too, Sunny, about, you know, I've spent tons of times in the tropics too, and would love to flesh that out more as well.
And if you would like to present, I mean, I'll just put this out to everyone. Just always looking for more people to connect with who are really passionate about this work. So, absolutely.
And on what Sunny was saying, I've experienced this with grant applications with the USDA specifically. We have some reviewers who will say, yes, this sounds really interesting. And then we have some reviewers who literally will just say kudzu is invasive. And then just that's it. And we're applying for grants to like do research and education to better understand really what the USDA created in the 30s and 40s in the southeastern United States by planting kudzu en masse. And there's this, again, it's like back to like remedial education to address bias is like an umbrella of all this work.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too that it's been hard for me as well just to do this series. The only way that we have gotten grant money to put the series on is through artist grants. So free thinkers, you know, people who want to solve problems and think creatively.
I just want to mention real quick, I noticed Cornelia Cho, you'd put something in the chat about lycopene and the prostate and iliac node. So I think that's another one to maybe take offline. If you just want to shoot me an email, then we can get further into that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. I'm a member of a local gardening group. I'm in Massachusetts, and I have just started. The reason I attended today, and this has been such an amazing presentation. Thank you, Marc, and to the other speakers and those who are offering comments and questions. I feel like I started off, this was just curious, and now I'm so excited. But I have been working to plan a program for a gardening club locally, where we're going to harvest. This is the idea, is that we're going to organize a group to harvest some autumn olives, and then turn them into a liqueur, and then, you know, have a sort of social event where we, you know, after we've let it like set or whatever it needs to do, have a social event where we're going to, you know, imbibe the liqueur. But part of that, of course, is the initial taking people out to harvest autumn olive. You know, I know that there are some, you know, I've spotted some like near the interstate. I'm hoping to find one, you know, more, you know, closer, like more conservation area in our town. I guess I just wanted to ask, you know, is there anything, since I'm sort of making myself responsible for taking a group into the wild to harvest autumn olive, is there anything that I need to be careful of, you know, sort of like in terms of, you know, my custodianship of the environment? Or is there anything that I should like read more about in order to make sure that I'm not, that we're not doing harm to the environment when we go out as a group?
Specifically with an autumn olive harvest?
Yeah.
You're saying? Well, I definitely think that would really fall into that realm of like, are you making the problem worse, you know, like by spreading it, because they have tons, you know, one shrub might have thousands of these little fruit. So you would really want to be fastidious and not spreading those. I mean, it kind of is an interesting realm that you're bumping up against, and maybe Sunny might have something to say about this too. I mean, I've kind of wondered, and I felt like I've gotten lucky, but like anytime you're taking on leading stuff with the public in such a litigious society as that we have, you know, and thinking about stuff like with authorities, I mean, I feel like I know lots of people that do it and get pretty lucky, but there are things like liability and insurance and maybe waiver forms. And I mean, that's more of like, you know, not maybe what you were thinking about as far as the ecological impacts, but as far as your personal thing, you know, I mean, depending on the group, you know, you really want to be comfortable with that group and like know that, you know, maybe somebody gets sick the next day and they're like, oh, you made me sick, you know, but it was like the thing that they got at the store afterwards, you know. I mean, these are just, and not to scare you away, because I mean, this is definitely stuff that we need happening, and for the most part it happens well, and I know very few stories where it did go sideways. But depending on if you're working for a nonprofit organization or some other institution that has fiduciary responsibility and these kinds of things, I think that's just something to at least like think about. As far as going out to harvest the autumn olives, I mean, one thing to think about is like you're trying to remove the autumn olives. It's like, well, what can you bring in instead too? You know, I guess as far as like kind of squaring that circle and not just focusing on the anti, even if you're getting something good out of it, but, you know, also like on the positive side, you know, of what you can be bringing in versus just taking away. I mean, always just the spirit of reciprocity, I feel like is part of that ethic piece.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Well,
I have one question, but I'm going to let anyone else, if anyone else wants to pop in. I just had a question about some of your favorite invasives to ferment. What have you been trying lately, or just on a personal?
oh, well, dandelion's of course super famous, right? Dandelion wine, and but then using those greens and that kind of thing be a kind of big one. Let me think, like right now, I mean, definitely making a kraut right now, which I'm actually probably going to do pretty soon. We have this thing called the Southeastern Permaculture Gathering, which is happening in a month, and it's probably going to be like 80 to 100 people, and we try to have as much awesome food as possible that's brought by the participants. So I'm thinking I'll probably make like a wild greens kraut, or once again, I'll still probably use like half store cabbage, but then the other half would be things like lamb's quarters and pigweed and the quickweed and maybe some purslane if found some personally, Queen Anne's lace, you know, Daucus carota. Yeah, and then I do a ton of brewing as well. So that would be kind of like probably like a different list, you know, like often you'll have bitters in brewing. So that might be something that you would use the barberry for your bitters, or chicory or dandelion. So to get for the bitter component of the brew.
So you would just ferment the pigweed like you would pickles or something, just leave it.
Yeah, just kind of like take the stalk and strip off the greens. I mean, you can also, the seeds are great, kind of like poppy seed, like substitute as well. So I've used those in a lot of different applications too, on cakes and in dressings. But you could put some of that in the kraut as well. But yeah, I wouldn't normally do the stems so much. And of course, with the pigweed, we're talking amaranthus species. Some have like really big leaves, like the callaloo ones, and then other ones have, you know, super tiny leaves, like Amaranthus retroflexus or something like that. And so if they had really tiny leaves, I would just strip all of those little tiny leaves off the stem and then put that in. Maybe chop the stem really fine, depending on how woody it was. Whereas if they were like more bigger, juicy, luscious kinds of things, then I might just kind of chop the whole top with the leaves and some of the stem.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, roots of Amaranthus spinosus in ferments. Nice. Yeah. You know, it's funny. That's one of my least favorite plants. Sunny just mentioned she's using the spiny pigweed, the Amaranthus spinosus. And man, once again, like the lamb's quarters, it can make 50,000, 60, 70,000 seeds. And when I was getting my undergraduate degree at the organic farm where I got my bachelor's at Warren Wilson College, we had the spiny pigweed. And you would go to pull it, and it looks a lot like the Amaranthus retroflexus I mentioned earlier, but you grab those spines and it's not like it just pokes you, but I find like it hurts sometimes for days. Like there's some kind of compound on those spines or some kind of microbe. But man, I take those things out like almost no other plant. That one and the Carolina horse nettle, which unfortunately that one's more poisonous.
Gaia, did you want to chime in with your comment, or I think we have 1 more minute, so.
Actually, yeah, I had a question because we were trying a couple of times. I was not personally involved in this project, but anyhow, with fermenting Japanese knotweed, and like every time we tried, we were unsuccessful. I don't know if you also have any comments on that.
That's another one that I've definitely fermented it in combination with other things. I've never tried like just a straight Japanese knotweed ferment. So yeah, it's very intensive from a chemistry standpoint and everything. So I kind of wouldn't be surprised. I think it would taste intense even kind of if it came out. But I think that part of it is about yeah, maybe other ingredients and kind of the ratio, you know, is part of it. I do also want to mention this idea, Gaia, you know, it comes to mind, this idea of the Gaia philosophy of the world being this kind of organism that, if not sentient, at least, I mean, this goes back to James Lovelock, and it was big for my teacher, Frank Cook, and I think it bears mentioning in this idea of humans know best kind of realm, whereas like there's actually this much greater 5-dimensional chess game going on that all the organisms are part of, and we're just like a tiny piece that Gaia has like the whole playing board like in mind for that. I think, yeah, it just bears mentioning that we need to humble ourselves to that kind of potentially greater process at work.
And that if humans are operating on this accelerated, globalized kind of like superorganism level, then the species who have the tools, so to speak, to like match that pace, those are the plant species that we're seeing this kind of like pattern system with. Knotweed is like one that really just stands out like globally as like what's going on here. There's like, and again, it's not to say like, yes, we should just sit back and like not do anything. It's more like, oh no, we need to be
it's a
paying
symptom,
more attention.
not the problem.
Yeah. And Gaja, did you try the really young knotweed? Did you try fermenting it when it's really young, the stalks?
Would that be your suggestion? Because I think we
Yeah.
did it a couple of years ago, and I don't remember
Yeah,
exactly. But
a landmate that I've been working with out in Marshall, North Carolina, she made some good like fermented, like very pickly, just little stalks with it, very young. And it's like crunchy, good, little pickles.
perfect. Gives me motivation to try again. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it there just for time's sake. But I mean, there's still a lot of people attending, so I don't know. We could continue, but
if there's any last burning questions, I'm so grateful for such a turnout, and please spread the word too. I mean, I'm sometimes reticent to do recording and things because it's so much more pressure and all these things, but I feel like the time has come that we just got to get this out there, you know, and so that's why I've agreed to this, and so please do tell other people.
Yes, please share Marc's work. Please attend his classes. Please listen to all of our free talks. There's so many amazing people out there doing this work, all of which I don't know all of them yet. So please contact me and share your knowledge if you have it. Thank you all for attending. This is so wonderful. And thank you so much, Marc. Yay.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thank you. And maybe, I don't know, since this is the last session of the season, we also state some closing remarks. I think that, yeah, we were just chatting before with Alyssa that we still have a lot of motivation to continue in any way that will be possible for us in the future, where we'll seek for funding and support to kind of, follow up those sessions. And again, if you have ideas or if you would like to present your work, as Alyssa already said, please write to us and we'll be happy to chat how this can go further. Also, if you have any comments on how this series was going for you, or if you have any suggestions for how we can make it better, I think we're also open to these comments and to your suggestions. And I also wanted to mention thank you again to Emmy Rice, who was making this wonderful illustration for the visual identity of the series. Also for Pina and Druk, who kind of funded us and make this thing happen, kind of financially supported us for this series. For our really amazing, wonderful guests who were willing to kind of share their knowledge and also allow us to record and spread the sessions. And also, for everyone who attended and kind of really enlarge this conversation with your comments and questions. And also, I would like to thank my partner in crime, Alyssa, for really hosting this and taking the lead in hosting these wonderful sessions. During, I don't know, I think we started somewhere in January or so, or no, even like in October. So it's been a while. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you, Gaia. It's a great collaboration, and we hope to continue. So thank you so much for that.
Cool. So hope to see you soon. And keep on doing your great work. And thank you, Marc, for today as well from my side.
Thank you. Maybe we can go to a walk at Lake Bled sometime and pick some wild greens.
You're welcome to visit and we'll take you around. Yes, with pleasure.
Yay. All right, all. Be well. Do good work. All right.
Bye-bye.
Peace.